Spotlights. This is the podcast for the Yale Forum on Religion and Ecology. And as usual, I'm your host, Sam Mickey. And this week, I'm really happy to welcome onto the show Beth Norcross. Beth, thank you so much for making time for us.
It's a delight. I'm so glad to be here, Sam.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to talking to you. And just a little bio for folks who might not be familiar with you. You're the executive director of the Center for Spirituality and Nature, and which is a really amazing center. We have to talk about the many different things that you offer. And then you have a book coming out, I believe, on Earth Day in 2025, April 22nd, and it's Discovering the Spiritual Wisdom of Trees, which you co-wrote with Leah Rampey. So a lot to talk about the book, a lot to talk about the center. But before we get into that, I'm always curious to hear about people's kind of life story, because anybody working at the intersection of the world of religion, spirituality, and faith with environmental issues, ecology, nature, those are often seen as very disparate. And if people want to get involved with the environment, they do science or get involved with public policy, or it's just activism, and they leave religion out of it. And conversely, people who are really interested in religion, often it's about otherworldly things and just trying to get to heaven when you die and things like that, or attaining personal enlightenment, but it's not necessarily about earth and nature. So what in your life led you to this kind of path?
Well, again, I really appreciate. I'm a big fan of the forum, so this is a pleasure for me. Well, we all have to begin somewhere. I think I've always been a nature lover and a church goer. But I was holding those things separately for a long time. I think I worked on Capitol Hill on parks and forest issues, which was such a great pleasure and opportunity, and then worked in the environmental community, and found that as respectful as I am of both of those institutions, Congress most of the time, and the environmental community, it felt to me like we weren't sort of getting to the heart of the matter. And so I went to seminary and I concentrated my efforts on eco-theology, did some work with Mary Evelyn on the Green Seminary Initiative and some other action-oriented faith things. But it also then still felt, as important as those actions were, that came out of a sense of ethics and morality from Christian perspective, Jewish perspective, etc., it felt to me that there was still something missing, that there was a grounding, there was a relationship that we all have inside of us, that ecological center that we may not remember, but that continues to burn in us from our earliest beginnings as humans. And it was in that relationship that I wanted to begin to explore. And so the center was born. It was just first me going out and doing some programs, and it just kind of got carried away, Sam. I mean, I'll tell you some more about that, but more and more we found people who were yearning for some kind of a deeper relationship, both with nature and spirit.
Mm.
Churches can and mosques and other religious institutions can feel, and I certainly identify with this, a little constraining. And so as people were leaving church, leaving organized religion, yet still yearning for community, still yearning for something. So we tried to meet those twin desires, those twin yearnings for time with earth and time with spirit.
Mm-hmm.
And we birthed the center. We've been around for almost 10 years now, and it's been a real honor and pleasure to do this work at this level.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. Because, I teach at the University of San Francisco. It's a Jesuit school, so officially Catholic. And so many students really don't like institutional religion. I'm like, you're at a Catholic school. And they're like, yeah, we like the education and things like that. But there's so many people who are just like, I have this yearning, like you call it, but they want to do it outside of traditional religious institutions. And so the idea of connecting more with spirituality than religion is really, I think, a growing trend. So it's so great that you have a center speaking to that, specifically in relationship to nature. And the thing I also like about the center, the offerings are so plentiful and diverse. There's so many ways to get involved. So I wonder if you could say, what it is that you do, and for just being around 10 years, it seems like a really robust center.
Mhm. Well, thank you. We do have a number of offerings and a number of different entry points, I think,
Yeah.
to this journey back to our what I might call our original selves. Um, one, with the natural world that we've gotten away from. We offer a number of what I would describe as one-off programs. We're just about to start again our 6-week Spiritual Wisdom of Trees program. We launched a new program on spirituality in the national parks this
Mhm.
spring. And then we had a poetry session. So we have a number of one-off programs. If that's what you want to do, is come in and out, that those are for you. We also have, as you noticed, a lot of resources related to spiritual practices that one might try. We have a book called Inside Out that is 50 spiritual practices that you can do in the natural world. We have seasonal guides that we offer too about how to go more deeply into this relationship and while we study the seasons. Um, and then, we were doing a number of these programs, Sam, and if people were asking us, this is great, what's next? And all those people who were leaving church, leaving organized religion, were asking us, we we want something deep and we want it to be in community. So we started some years ago our spirituality and nature group program. We have about 40 now around the country. We just had 90 people go through our training
Oh, wow.
last week. We have a book, starting your own spirituality and nature group, or what we call SINGs.
Hmm.
So we offer one-off programs, and our spirituality and nature groups. And also, there's a lot going on social too. We're
Hmm.
continually trying to put forth small videos, blogs. I'm going to do one next week on the election. What does the natural world teach us and tell us about uncertain times? So there's a lot going on. I would commend your listeners to take a look at our website.
Yeah, I would too. It's really amazing. A lot of great resources, very accessible. And I also appreciate the social media outreach because I feel like religion and spirituality don't get represented that well because a lot of those folks are a little, especially when you're interested in nature, we're often a little phobic about technology. And so the idea of making videos and posting online, we're like, no, don't be online, go out into nature. Like, well, you need to tell people online to not be online so much. So it's a weird paradox, but I appreciate that. I know here at the forum, that's been something that we've been kind of hesitant to do much, and we're starting to get more involved in social media outreach. So, such important work.
We're trying to, meet people where they are. And I'll give you an example. I was out in Sequoia National Park last week, and
Mm.
I was blown away by these big trees. So I was, throwing things out on social media and so forth. But a couple of years ago, I did a very short video on loneliness.
Mm.
Back to our point of, if you don't, one of the benefits of organized religion is its instant community.
Yeah.
And so what do you do if you do not have this community? So I put this out. It was, I don't know, 2.5 minutes or something like that. And it's had somewhere in the neighborhood of 500,000 views.
Wow.
It wasn't anything that I said, or it was I who had to say it. It was just this touching people where they were. 500,000 people looked at that or sent it along. To me, it's a a sign that people are really wanting some kind of connection and are terribly, terribly lonely now. And where are they going to be? They're going to be online. And so that was if I needed some reassurance that we should be on social, that was it.
Yeah, that's pretty great. When a message like that goes viral, which is probably not the best metaphor really for a popular post, especially after the COVID pandemic. I don't
We'll
know.
think of something else.
I'll think of something else. Yeah, maybe going rhizomatic or something like that.
There you
Um,
go. I like that. If only everybody understood that.
I know. Yeah, that's true. That's a little of an insider term for people into trees and plants and fungi and things like that. But yeah, that's great reassurance. And it really is, you're such a in between time right now where the old forms of community aren't connecting with people, and yet the new kinds of community are just now being built. And so that's kind of that it's a tough phase to be in where the old systems aren't totally working, but the new systems are struggling to be born. And so great that you're contributing to that and providing an outlet for people to make those kind of connections.
Well, it's a perfect place in which to do that because, as you know, the natural world or the non-human part of the natural world is naturally in community. They cannot survive without community. And so our spirituality and nature groups are designed to not only be one with your human neighbor, but to find your eco community as well
Right.
and immerse yourself in this broader community, which was the message of that loneliness post, was that it's out there. It's the community of nature is just waiting for us to come and to notice and to
Yep.
see and to fall back in love with it and act in its behalf. You know, it's it's all. I mean, so that's why the so-called natural world is such an important, essential, wonderful place for community because it's not, I'll just go riff for a second. One of my little bugaboos is that in church groups that I've been involved with and others, I'm sure, is, we go outside, but the environment is just a pretty backdrop. We may say something about creation or created or something, but what is it like to really engage personally with the tree, with the cricket, with the poison ivy, things that we love and things that we don't love so much? And what are the lessons in there for us and for acceptance and adaptation and all of that?
Yeah. Yeah, I know. In the last few years, I've gotten a lot more interested in birds, just because I happen to live in a place in Northern California that has a lot of bird diversity, and
Oh,
so just learn to
wonderful.
identify them and things like that. And even a little bit before our discussion today, I was outside and there was a little scrub jay kind of in my path,
Mhm.
and it just wasn't getting out of the way. It wasn't afraid of me. And I was like, "Hey, buddy, like look out! I'm gonna step on you." And they kind of just hopped over. And then on my way back, it was back in that same spot. And I find myself like talking to birds now in a way that I didn't before. And like you said, the environment's just kind of a pretty backdrop. I definitely felt that, even as somebody who's really cares about environmental issues and tries to think ecologically. For some reason, birds were never on the horizon for me. They were just like, oh, those are pretty. And now I've gotten familiar with them, and I talk to them and say, excuse me. And it's amazing how much that really does add a sense of belonging and community into my life.
If you were doing one of our programs, I would ask you what switched for you, what changed.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think some of it was during the pandemic when which of course is kind of ongoing, so it's not like it's over, but the worst piece of it was over. So in 2020 when everybody's social distancing and things like that, and when you don't have your fellow humans around, I was just like, "Oh, wait, who's this?" And noticing a robin or a finch or a sparrow or a scrub jay. And so then I kind of got a little obsessed with trying to learn who's who and then putting out the bird seed so they'd come in my yard and things like that. And then it really just, I was like, oh, I actually feel at home. I feel like these are my friends. This is my community. So it's that weird thing when one thing's taken away, like being with humans, then all of a sudden the more than human world showed up in a new way for me.
It's hard to be lonely
Yeah.
when you notice and when you see community all around you. My brother likes to say, "They're watching us, Beth. They're watching us."
Yeah,
And just
exactly.
imagining all the eyes that are, on us. I'm glad you mentioned the pandemic too, because it's very interesting to me. Droves of people came outside during the
Mhm.
pandemic, and they're still there. I mean, as you know, I was out at Sequoia and Kings Canyon National Parks last week, and here it was, the end of September in the middle of the week, and I'm here to tell you they're still there.
Hmm.
The Park Service, is breaking all sorts of records, and yes, I think people were yearning to get out. I think there was something else tugging at them. There was something in that, um, in the tragedy of that moment where people wanted to be one with the natural world, whether they could name it or not. And people asked, we did a number of programs. We couldn't take as many people outside, even protected at first. So we did these hybrid programs. We did an online, and then we sent people out to their backyards. And what we're trying to do at the center, and in all the work, and in your work too, I'm sure, is that is to meet that need, that yearning that people may or may not be able to articulate, those hundreds of thousands of people that were out in the parks this summer, and give them a little guidance on how to go a little deeper,
Hmm.
how to meet that yearning, whether they're aware of it or not, to give them a little counsel on how they might pay attention and be mindful and to see other and to meet, that need that they have, and then eventually see that need that the non-human has as well, and we meet in our mutual need.
Hmm.
I I think there's a reason why folks were outside, whether they were able to articulate it.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's a really great example. And it's like when things are really broken and things are, times are tough, we look back to like the last sane moment we knew, and we're like, oh, wait, there was something we had a long time ago that we lost. And it's this nature connection. And so there's a sense of like, it's time to come home.
Mhm.
And once things are broken, you notice them. It's kind of like when something's not where you remember it, then all of a sudden, oh wait, where did I put that? And so that's, yeah, it's a weird kind of benefit to the pandemic, is it did help people reconnect with that ancient sense of connection to something bigger than ourselves, something bigger than ourselves that's here now. Because we often think something bigger than ourselves, oh, spirit, it's otherworldly. It's like, no, it's right here. It's in the plants, it's in the animals, it's in our landscapes.
I certainly identify with that. And it's one of the things that in our both in our book that you were kind enough to mention, Discovering the Spiritual Wisdom of Trees, and also this TEDx, and in this course that we're about to do, that we really talk about the lessons that the trees can teach us
Mm.
about how to be resilient and how to adapt and how to accept, where we are right now, politically, environmentally, and it's it's a pretty it's a pretty difficult time in many ways. It's an uncertain time, and trees have been around for 350 million years. They've learned a few things about how to be how to continue to stand and bear witness in the midst of all of these
Mm.
challenges. You've undoubtedly been to Sequoia. It was my first time, and to watch these giants that have been around for 2,000 years, and their resistance to fire, in particular, the trees that have these huge scars going up 30 or 40 feet. And one tree that I saw was completely hollow inside, and it had this huge lightning scar.
Mhm.
And I looked up and I could see all the way up into the top of the tree, which is, I don't know, 100 or more feet in the air. And I realized it was still living. Its its heart had been culled out,
Mhm.
and yet it was still living. So it reminds me too of what we're facing in climate change and our personal griefs, that we're not going to be the same. We can't be the same. That there there may in fact be holes in our heart,
Mhm.
and yet we will learn how to survive in the midst of this, in this hole, in the midst of this trauma, in the midst of this disturbance, um, grief and loss needing to be acknowledged and mourned. And the
Mhm.
tree's not ever the same. We won't be the same. And so there's just so much wisdom, I think, out there.
That's a powerful example. And so yeah, this is a good time to talk more about the book, Discovering the Spiritual Wisdom of Trees. There's been so much research in the last, I don't know, decade or two of people discovering that things that like indigenous communities have known for a long time, which is that trees aren't just resources, they're not just lumber, but are in fact communicating. They have intelligence and agency. There's so much going on there. And it's really remarkable. I mean, even in like the 1960s and 70s with the animal rights movement, people are like, hey, you know what? Animals aren't machines. They have feelings, they can communicate, they have intelligence. And then finally, we're getting around to trees, and people are recognizing this. But one of the things I'm noticing in the literature, it's often really focusing on things like communication and intelligence or agency, but the spiritual wisdom isn't being talked about that much. I feel like that's one of the really special things that your book is contributing, and I know there's a few other people out there who are bringing that to the fore. But for the most part, I feel like the scientists who are working on a lot of this are still kind of allergic to talking about religion and spirituality, and they're afraid it's going to be too new age or woo woo or whatever term they want to use to be dismissive of it. So I wonder if you could kind of speak to that, to the fact that it's spiritual wisdom that you're discovering in trees.
Yeah. Well, we wrestled with that a lot, Leah and I did, and we wanted to begin the book by explaining what we meant by spirituality, because it's a term that we throw around a
Yeah,
lot,
yeah,
and we don't always define it.
yeah.
And what we mean by that, in response to your question, is that each being has in its essence a spiritual nature, and that, our sense, and again, this is just, I'll speak for myself here, and not even Leah, that my sense is there's something larger that is ongoing around us and within us. We have many names for it: God, Allah, Spirit. I have a young pastor friend who calls it the great whatever. But there is that sense, and for me anyway, that there is something larger that is both uniting us. It's both it's both larger than we and internal to all beings, including trees and humans and so forth. And so it manifests, I think, where the woo woo and we, I'm theologically trained, Sam. We will not woo woo in this. Well, we've been accused. I think that we need to be careful, and in our scholarship and so forth. But our sense is that there is a oneness. There's a unity, and that's really as far as we're able to go. And I think that's demonstrated by the communication, not only the communication, but the mutual dependence
Mm.
between the trees and themselves and the fungi and the birds that take their acorns and go plant and the squirrels, and it's all of a system. And to us that is an expression of spirit
Mm.
as we understand it. And it manifests itself, spirit, she, they, manifest self differently in us than it might a tree. And that's where I think we get confused, because the tree doesn't speak our words and our language. We assume that it can't have a spiritual life because it doesn't express itself in the same way that we do.
Yeah. And I think that's one of the things that's so interesting to me is that it's not just working across species boundary, but across a whole kingdom. And to learn, it's one thing, like I learned so much from my cat. Like, yeah, but we're both mammals, so we kind of speak the same language, even though I don't use a tail to communicate as much as she does, or I don't wiggle my ears and things like that. But to learn from a tree, that's such a big difference. And to understand communication and intelligence, and or even something like having your heart torn out from lightning and fire. I think that's such a profound thing to be able to learn across that big of a difference. Um, so I wonder, what are some of the things, the kind of spiritualism of trees that you find are the most different from us and yet the most similar? I think one that you've already mentioned is the idea of having your heart ripped out but still learning to survive, which so speaks to our time. So I
Mhm.
wonder if there is any other lessons like that where they're so different than us and yet so much the same, speaking to that kind of oneness. Like
Mhm.
we're all part of one community, and yet that oneness isn't homogenous. It's definitely full of variety and diversity.
Mhm. Well, so many examples. There's one one thing that I like to talk about that we talked about in the book some is how trees accept who they are.
Mm.
Now, that's a concept. Well, what choice do they have? Well, what choice do we have? I mean, I've lived long enough to know this is what you get, hon. I mean, I can try to change and push and all that. So I was really struck. I was out on a walk a few years ago, sort of struggling with some sense of not enoughness that we all
Mm.
do, from time to time. And, perhaps I don't really remember the situation. Someone I knew had published some book, and I thought, where are you? Why aren't you written this book? Blah, blah, blah. Well, no, of course. But and I was out with the trees, and this is again, did the trees speak to me? Did they say, now, Beth? Um, but I was watching it. It was a white oak with that, sort of shaggy bark that it has and those lobe leaves. And I noticed that it was not envious or jealous or judgmental toward itself. It was not trying to be a red oak, let alone a maple or a conifer, God forbid,
Right.
right? It just was really in its own way trying to be the best individual white oak that it could be. And so um, I've been thinking about that a lot. And this, you can say, well, trees can't accept, well, they don't, they don't fight. They don't fight who they are.
Right.
They also don't fight the injuries that they have. They heal over and they form burls and galls and all sorts of things, and then they continue on. It
Mm.
reminds me, you're a cat person. We have dogs, and you know how they put those collars on when they can't
All
scratch
right.
themselves, those horrible things. And they just accept. They just go about their business and accept who they are. And that's how that message of the tree. Did the tree speak to me? I think the tree did speak to me. by way of example, by
Mm.
way of model. The other thing I might mention is that we encourage people in our classes and in the book to go and find a teacher tree
Mm.
for the duration of the class and while they're reading the book, and just be with it, and we with her, excuse me, or
Mm.
him, and see them, and watch how they've lived their lives. And so the adaptations that trees make around obstacles, they're they're humorous in terms of, there's another tree that gets in the way, or a rock or something, and it sort of twists this way, and then then some other tree comes and blocks the light, and goes that way. And the willingness of just adapting. And I think we are in a period of time now that we're going to be doing a lot of adapting, or we darn well better be doing a lot of adapting. And
Yeah.
lastly, I would just say, in that same regard, trees are always searching for light.
Mm.
Capital Light,
Yeah.
as well as understanding the necessity of the times in darkness.
Mm.
And that's another lesson that the trees have communicated to me.
That's great. Yeah, I appreciate this idea of trees as role models. Such an important
Mm,
part of ethics. Like, how do we learn how to be our best selves? You're going to need a role model. There's certainly some ethical theorists who are like, no, you just need rational arguments. Like, something more needs to be there. And certainly for virtue ethics, how do you cultivate virtue? You're going to need to find somebody who does it well. And for people like Aristotle or something, you're going to find other Greek men to show you how to be the best you can be. But it turns out, no, you can actually use trees as role models, and this sense of non-judgmental self-acceptance, the ability to continually search for light while also accepting periods of darkness. Those are profound lessons. I especially appreciate you mentioned the humor with which they maintain their resilience and respond to obstacles. So I think that's lost on a lot of us who work with kind of spiritual ecology and those kinds of things. Is sometimes it can get a little too serious, and we wallow in a valley of despair, and we forget, like, oh, actually, there's something extremely comical about our moment. It's not just tragedy.
absolutely. And delight, just delight. I mean, you're a bird lover now. We travel to Florida quite a bit, and I've fallen in love with the roseate spoonbill. You
Hmm.
can't look at a roseate spoonbill, that pink bird with the floppy, and it sort of looks for food like this and filters the water. You can't not laugh. I mean, it's hysterical. And there are all manner of beauty and humor, and even if it's our interpretation of, that humor. I want to, if we could, in the midst of all that has been happening in Florida and North
Mm.
Carolina and South Carolina and Georgia, I just wanted to speak to that, if I might, just
Yeah.
briefly. It is very easy for those of us who love the natural world to romanticize it. And one of the lessons is important, I think, for all of us, is to see that nature can be a violent place. I mean, I sat here and watched a hawk take a little bird not
Mm.
too long ago. There's violence. And certainly seen it in the destruction of late. Now we can talk all about building in floodplains and things like that. That is small comfort to the people who have lost their homes suddenly, tragically. And I think that it's incumbent upon those of us who want deep relationships with the natural world, to hold those things at the same time, and in intention. Water, goodness, plays a role in every major spiritual tradition. Living water, and yet the waters that ran through Western North Carolina were anything but living. And so I don't have much to add to that. I don't have much. understanding of that, but I feel deeply that we need to acknowledge that and hold that along with all the wonderful things that we've talked about today around
Yeah.
the non-human part of nature.
Yeah. Yeah. I appreciate you bringing that up. And yeah, Hurricane Helene. I have some family in Florida, and they were like, "Oh, don't worry, we're far enough away from it." And they still like evacuated just in case because the storm surge was pretty bad. But everything ended up being fine. And even when they got home, the power was on. And then who knew how catastrophic this would be for some places? I think of like Asheville, North Carolina in particular, because it's like 200 miles from the coast. The idea that they're vulnerable to hurricanes was just unthinkable before now. And so we really are seeing such a massive change in our experience of what the normal habits of the natural world are. And so, so yeah, appreciate you bringing that up. I have a student who has family in Asheville. She's from Asheville. And so she wrote to me and was like, I don't know if I'm coming to class this week. I hope you can be flexible. And I was like, oh, certainly. Like you're dealing with the reality of a situation that we talk about in the abstract in class. We talk about religion, nature, and things like that. And she's like, yeah, that's alive for me right now. There's a real urgency, and this is a serious emergency. So, yeah, I feel like it's one of the kind of most difficult things of our time is to really honor the tragedy while still kind of thinking of somebody like Martin Luther King. He's like, I'm not going to wallow in a valley of despair. I have a dream, while still honoring that there's a lot to despair about.
And our role in causing that
Yeah,
despair, and how we drive and flying to San Francisco willy-nilly
right.
last week, and our homes and how we heat them and so forth. So it's it's sometimes too easy to be romantic about natural world, and I think it does a disservice to nature and to us. Um, my husband is a lovely man, but he is not perfect, and my acknowledging where his imperfections, his acknowledging mine, um, places where we are not as kind as we might mean, seeing the full person is
Hmm.
important to a loving relationship.
Yeah.
And I think that is the same way that we're trying to approach the natural world. There's so many aspects of of nature, and my husband for that matter, that I don't understand, that I'll never understand.
Right.
uh, and yet, I still am in a loving relationship. That might sound like a trite example, but love of the natural world is seeing it and knowing it fully. I mean, as you're approaching the birds now, and falling in love with it and acting out of love in its behalf, but not all, and also understanding that there are many aspects of it that we don't we don't necessarily understand.
Yeah. Yeah, and like your example of a hawk getting another bird, it's like predation is such a massive part of nature and so painful in so many ways. And I know there are some kind of animal rights activists who are like, maybe we can stop predation from happening. We'll just feed the hawks some protein supplements and things like that. And then they say, well, then all the prey are going to overpopulate. And they're like, okay, we'll give the prey birth control. And so there's, and it's like, I get where they're coming from because it does hurt. It hurts to see how much pain is part of nature, but that's the mystery of it. And that's really the beauty is that this is it, life feeds on life, and earth systems are highly complex and uncertain and can be very chaotic, and that's where the beauty is. That's the truth of Gaia, of Earth, of nature, and yeah, it's hard to accept. And again, like you said, a good role model for that acceptance: trees. Look at how they can embrace the violence and still learn to survive.
And in that predation, it is rarely, sometimes, but rarely gratuitous. And, it is purposeful. It is it's feed the young, stay alive, so forth. I mean, there are obviously territorial issues among, many animals and birds and so forth. Your jay, I spent some time with your jay. Very aggressive.
Yeah.
But there's some modeling that, as well in terms of how we get along.
Yeah.
But I will say, and before we close today, that there are, back to the spiritual for a second. There's a passage in the book, and maybe I'm giving it away, so that I come back to, and that is that I talk about a time we bought some land out in Western Virginia, and there were trailers, and we were going to bring this land back, and do all these good things with it, and oh, by the way, build a little eco house just for us, right? So we put the vernal pond, back together, and we took all the trailers down, and we replanted native species, and we virtuous, right? Well, there was where one of the trailers were just a marvelous pine grove started to grow with this much effort on our part. It just emerged. And of course, it's natural regeneration. It's coming from the pines around it and the birds bringing in the seed. And I think about that grove a lot because I never imagined that underneath the ground, something magical and mystical and, dare I say, spiritual was happening. There was all this new life being formed outside of my knowledge, of my view, and it just emerged. And so it feels hopeless sometimes. And I know this is, again, a very difficult time for many in the climate change movement and so forth. I'd like to just wonder what spirit and soil are cooking up beyond our sight, beyond our viewing. What's going on? Not to say we shouldn't do our part. And I certainly believe in participating in hope. Mm-hmm. I also think mystery and that spirit and soil and land might have a few surprises for us. I hope so.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really beautiful example. And it reminds me, the Apostle Paul in one of his letters talks about hope against hope. And it's like, these are hopeless times, and yet we hope. And that kind of hope against hope, it's like something is in store. And the regenerative capacities of the planet are impossible to overestimate. And like, it's working on something. And I like the idea, especially like, okay, beneath the ground, I can't see it. I don't know what's there. And yet life springs forth. Well, I wonder, one last question for you. Kind of a frivolous question in a way. I'm just curious. Do you have a favorite tree? I know for me, I've been living in Northern California for almost 20 years now and really fallen in love with it. And so, of course, redwoods, I've really fallen in love with those. And coast oak is another one. Especially, I like oak because it's just so twisted and it's almost like a survival strategy. It's like, nobody's going to chop me down because this wood is almost impossible to use as lumber. So I wonder if there's one particular tree that has really spoken to you as a role model, or just because you like the look of it, whatever it might be. Is there some tree? I don't want to play favorites, but do you have a favorite?
You're going to make me choose among my children.
Yeah, exactly. It's the worst question.
A couple of things come to mind. As you know, as I said, I was out in the sequoias. It's very hard not to be moved by a tree that is as large as this office is, and to feel humble and modest and cared for and not so responsible for everything. So that was I'm still processing that experience. There is a tree. I'm not going so far as to call it a favorite tree, but it's on my walking route, and I spend a lot of time with it. It's a very spindly little black locust tree that's trying desperately to live in the midst of all these oaks that try to keep it from being in the light. And it's I don't know, it's 10 feet tall or 12 feet, and it's a little ragged. And I've just fallen in love with that little tree, and she teaches me a lot about survival, about aging, about continuing to search for the light, even though your branches are busted up and broken, and there's just a little bit of green on top. And maybe I've gotten to a point in life where that's what's inspiring me right now. But she's my girl right now. Yeah.
That's a wonderful example. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And I appreciate you said it's not necessarily my favorite because I'm not gonna choose favorites because that's just not fair. But always interesting to hear where people are finding teachers and role models in the more than human world. So really wonderful. And I think that's a great note to end on before we get back into the despair side of things, which is easy to do. Try
Mhm.
to end on a high note. So, geez, Beth Norcross, thank you so much. And I'm really excited for the book. I'll definitely be reading it. Discovering Spiritual Wisdom of Trees, out on Earth Day 2025. So, for folks listening or watching, make sure to get that pre-order in. It's going to be a delight. I think it sounds fun, also informative, also inspiring. So thanks so much for that work. Thanks for your work with the Center for Spirituality and Nature, and just always nice to talk with a kindred spirit.
Lovely to talk to you, Sam, as well. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. It's really been a pleasure, and as always, thanks to people for tuning in. We'll be back with some more conversations for you soon. In the meantime, take care and be well.